Hello there, John Kuturilo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, thank you to everyone who makes my work possible. In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing a couple of philosophies which I hypothesize are closely correlated in terms of how they manifest in society: nihilism and hedonism. I'm going to be discussing what these philosophies mean and the potential consequences of abiding them, including the dangers. Now, before we begin, remember, as usual, that nothing that you find on the internet or in the media is advice. If you have concerns about yourself or someone else, please stop listening right now and seek advice from a professional. I'd also like to clarify that I'm not suggesting that you're a bad person if you identify as a nihilist or a hedonist, but I would suggest that you at least reflect on the effects that these philosophies can potentially have in your life and whether there are healthier philosophies which you can abide that may allow you to live a psychologically healthier life. It's not to suggest that anyone of a philosophy other than mine is a bad person or is of less worth, but I have enough experience to know what types of ethos tend to be correlated with certain consequences, and I know that philosophies like nihilism and hedonism don't necessarily have the best effects on those who abide them. So please take my reflection here for what it is. To define our terms, nihilism is a philosophy based on the premise that life and the ideas which we hold to be objectively true are actually not objectively true or meaningful, that there is actually, in fact, no inherent meaning or life, no inherent purpose. And there are some arguments that could extend from that, for example, that life has no inherent virtue, that there is no inherent good in life, or that the ideas that we hold to be objectively true are in fact socially constructed for various purposes. Now, the philosophy of hedonism is somewhat more broad. It's effectively based on the premise that our primary goals in life should be the pursuit of pleasure in and of itself for its own worth. And an extension of that is also that we should try to avoid discomfort or anything that is displeasurable in any way as much as possible. Now, let us reflect first on nihilism. One could make a valid argument that there is not as much of a stated purpose in life as some people assume, in the sense that much of what we hold to be true in life are the ideas which we are actually taught. And a lot of those ideas don't have a basis in objective reality, in the sense that there is no entity that specifically tells us to live a certain way, and there is no entity that specifically regulates and distributes desirable consequences to people who follow these ideas and negative consequences to people who don't, other than entities which we create ourselves. For example, authorities and authority figures, governments, and so forth. But those are phenomena which we create. Nature didn't create them. That said, this is not to say that there is no such thing as objective truth or ideas that are inherently more logical than others. One of the most important truths is natural order. Nature does operate with regularity. Nature and everything that it includes, all living beings, sentient and non-sentient, and all other entities, they operate according to a specific set of patterns and a specific set of consequences which interact with each other. Certain ideas or certain nature are more valid than others because certain ideas are going to cause outcomes that are more likely to lead to consequences that are objectively beneficial to all entities involved in a given situation. If there was not that regularity in nature, then what we have in the world simply wouldn't be possible. Think about the years that species have survived, including the human race. Think about the capacity of species to learn about actions and consequences and learning to adapt to their environments. Think about how different species actually function in completely different ways that allow them to survive. The most parsimonious conclusion, that is to say the one with the fewest assumptions, is that there must be some set of laws or some set of basic truths that regulate these occurrences. So even if determining what is objectively true or purposeful may be difficult or even impossible, we can argue with almost certainty that there are certain laws according to which nature operates, and therefore that there must be certain ideas that are objectively more healthy or more valid than others. So natural order is one of the most basic truths. Now, one of those regularities which we have observed throughout the history of the human race is that our minds function in a specific way, and they function more effectively under certain conditions than they do under others. The history of psychology has taught us that people will be happier and more constructive in their lives under certain conditions. They will be so when they have a sense of purpose, when they have a reason to arise from sleep every day and undertake constructive and fruitful activities, and when they feel that those activities are actually returning something beneficial to them, even if it is simply the sense of satisfaction of benefiting the world in some way. The mind functions better when there is a structure to guide it and when there is a sense of expectancy about what will happen and when, or at the very least, a sense of expectancy about what we should do. People tend to feel more fulfilled and also be more effective at survival when they are self-reliant. That is to say, when they take responsibility for learning how to adapt and be constructive rather than relying on external sources. People tend to be more successful when they are willing to make a short-term sacrifice with a view to obtaining a long-term benefit. And people tend to be happier and more constructive when they find personal meaning in what they do in life and when they are willing to expend effort for themselves in achieving the goals. Having a sense of purpose in life and making conscientious, deliberate efforts to achieve that purpose, or at the very least, making conscientious and deliberate efforts on a regular basis to guide ourselves in a constructive direction, is correlated psychologically with better adaptivity, that is to say, with a greater tendency to be able to survive and flourish in the world. And there are various different types of studies on various different types of constructs and concepts that in psychology have demonstrated this to be true. Now, the problem with nihilism is that it tends to ignore much of this truth, and it tends to also be associated with, not inherently cause, but be associated with a set of problematic ideals or behaviours that don't tend to correlate with the most constructive outcomes. If one believes in nihilism, then they tend to feel less of a need for self-responsibility or long-term planning or restraint of impulses, because if life has no inherent meaning, then why should we restrain ourselves from doing what feels right to us in the moment? And so this is why people may be led into using drugs or excessively spending money, pursuing activities that don't have much of a constructive nature. For example, excessive use of electronic entertainment, games, television, and similar. Not to say that you're worthless if you game. I know that a lot of people game, and I'm not judging that, but doing it excessively very much removes you from the real world. Also, attempting hobbies and then surrendering very quickly because they don't seem to bring the immediate sense of pleasure or the immediate sense of satisfaction that a person might seek. Those are all quite nihilistic tendencies. Another tendency is avoidance coping, and avoidance coping is refusing to engage with a particular challenge because it makes us uncomfortable regardless of the possible benefits of engaging with that challenge. As I've discussed before, we do become psychologically healthier when we approach our challenges and deliberately develop means of coping with them. Avoidance as a coping mechanism tends to actually weaken us psychologically. I found that nihilism tends to be associated with externalization, and externalization means to place responsibility for the events of our life on entities outside of ourselves. It tends to be associated with the rhetoric that the world is to blame for my problems, society oppresses me or other people, the world should take care of us, and quite often, frighteningly enough, deference to authority. The government should do this because we deserve it, the government should ban that because we deserve to be free of it. Through this is a rather elitist tendency, the tendency to view themselves on an unconscious level as cool or edgy, thinking that they're quite hip and quite au fait with the science, so to speak, or what's best for society, and expecting others to sacrifice what they may want because they think that they know what's best for society. There's a sense of self-righteous smugness associated with it. In addition to that, what I suspect often develops from it is a rather disagreeable style of communication. If you've ever read a media article or heard or listened to a media broadcast or a podcast in which the person clearly has an opinion about something but doesn't immediately state in very concise terms what that opinion is and explain in very concise terms what the evidence is to support that opinion, or at the very least what the argument is. And their communications are full of sarcasm, obscure humour, references which only a select number of people would understand, but without the dry clarity that potentially any person could understand. In other words, tailoring that communication to be understandable by the masses, then you'll know what I mean. And as a side note, this is the reason why I don't use a lot of humour in my program, because there's enough of that in the world, and people who listen to me because they want to know immediately what my arguments are and what logic I'm trying to use. What is the connection between nihilism and hedonism, and why are these characteristics a problem? What's the underlying psychology that's problematic about this? Well, hedonism as a virtue can be extrapolated from nihilism if we extend the logic that way. One could very well argue, if life has no inherent meaning, then why should we bother making sacrifice and suffering when we can simply live for pleasure, when we can simply seek pleasure in the present moment and enjoy it? Because before we know it, we're going to be dead, so we might as well enjoy life while we have it. With that comes a lot of apathy. A person may be apathetic about the consequences of simply seeking pleasure with no consideration of any of the additional factors that are involved. Now, here's the major problem. The way that we think influences how we feel and how we behave. When we feel and behave a certain way, that yields consequences on ourselves and on the environment. Our mind, often unconsciously, uses the consequences of that as feedback, which then continues to influence how we think and how we feel. That's a concept known as reciprocal determinism. Nihilism acts on the mind in a way that is completely opposite to what would be optimal for a person's mind to actually function well. If we believe that life has no inherent meaning, unconsciously you are setting yourself to feel quite bleak and quite hopeless, because the belief that life has no inherent meaning is going to make all the hardships that we experience in life, which we all experience, it's going to make them appear as though there's no point to them. Why should we suffer if life has no purpose and the only result of it on the other side is going to be death? If we believe that, then we're going to act in accordance with that belief, which often means being hedonistic and being apathetic, doing what we want when we want it without regards for the consequences, not putting the requisite effort into life to actually achieve something, not being conscientious, but rather simply letting life happen as it does without as much deliberation and planfulness as would be optimal. That's going to then yield poor results. If we don't put effort into life, it is a plain fact that we will not yield the most desirable results. When we don't see desirable results, then our sense of hedonism is going to say, well, if you don't yield desirable results immediately, it must be bad. And the sense of externalization is going to say, well, it's everyone else's fault. Therefore, it's not worth pursuing because I didn't get the sense of pleasure that I wanted from it immediately. And because it's the world's fault, and because life is miserable and there's no inherent meaning in it, there's no point in me even trying to be better or to yield a better result because it's never going to work. That attitude is unconsciously going to affect how well you deal with the world, and it's unconsciously going to have an adverse effect on how much effort you spend on it, which is going to continue to yield the same poor results, which in turn is going to reinforce that belief that life is inherently meaningless and that there is no purpose in trying to yield anything of virtue from it because it's always going to be miserable. And therefore you might as well simply pursue pleasure in the moment because that's the only virtue that you're going to find in life before you die. If that's the way you live your life and you haven't even begun to take as much control of it as you actually can, how do you actually know that others or the world are to blame? How can you actually posit that as the definite answer to your problems when you don't know what could actually happen if you were to spend a significant amount of effort and to actually be planful and to work with the world in a purposeful way? The answer is you don't. Yes, no matter how hard you work, you can still fail, but it's not until you actually spend effort in life that you learn of the possibility of succeeding. A problem that extends from this is that we tend to be attracted to people who think like us, and when we are in the presence of other people who think like us, the fact that they think like us tends to reinforce the validity of our beliefs. So there's then a very real danger that we might associate with other nihilists, and that just reinforces not only our belief in nihilism as a virtue, but also it reinforces the underlying belief that life is miserable and pointless, and that there's no point spending effort in it. And because this happens at an unconscious level and it's characterized by the avoidance of discomfort, including anything that even remotely challenges our views, which is one of the main sources of discomfort which affects us psychologically on a regular basis, what we then tend to do is avoid anything and anyone that challenges that nihilistic worldview and instead simply keep with and absorb the rhetoric of people who agree with our nihilistic point of view. The result? We never get exposed to alternative standpoints. We never get exposed to alternative possibilities, for example, alternative lifestyles that could actually be more constructive for us. And the philosophy self-perpetuates. And another quite concerning aspect of this problem is that often nihilism is found amongst the types of communities that tend to treat science as a dogma. That is to say, you must trust the science, and if you don't, you're a square, you're uncool, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a bigot, you're all kinds of labels. But if you actually learn psychological sciences, you'll learn of just how dangerous nihilism and hedonism are. And furthermore, you'll learn why they function the way they do. And when, as a hedonist, you become defensive and accusatory of people who even remotely challenge you, even if it's a constructive challenge, then you're falling subject to one of the most dangerous lies to which we fall subject in psychology, which is anything that disagrees with me is bad and everything that agrees with me is good. It's one of the most basic biases that we can have, but it's extremely dangerous because, as I've said continuously in my program and in my content, and which I will continue to say, no person is so objective and so finely attuned that they are the sum of all wisdom and that they can perceive all aspects of the world in absolute objectivity so as to eliminate all possible sources of bias from their perception and to be able to specify exactly who is wrong and who is right with absolute objectivity. We are all biased in some way, including me. We all have flaws in the way that we process the information from the world. This is why we have to be not necessarily open-minded, that's a different story, but at least be critically minded enough to be willing to listen to and investigate or examine many different types of ideas from many different types of people. And even if we don't agree with them, at least give them the benefit of the doubt and examine them carefully and try to learn something from them, even if the most objective conclusion which we can draw from them is still to agree with your original standpoint because new evidence has confirmed it. At least then you are making the effort to test your beliefs. But in conclusion, even though there are certain ideas that are objectively healthier than others in life, life doesn't give you meaning in the sense that there are numerous different pursuits that you could take in life. The major existential problem is that there are no guarantees about which of those will be successful. You could follow the advice of the most successful people in the world and still fail. You could do everything the right way as far as you reasonably could and still fail. Or you could do something that has benefited absolutely no one and be highly successful. That's not the regular course of events, but unfortunately there is no other entity in life which can account for our actions and consequences other than ourselves. We have to be willing to take the risk of living in the world, taking chances, responsible chances at that, making sacrifice, suffering occasionally, hopefully. Some people have to suffer regularly, and that's no less a tragedy, but being willing to suffer some sacrifice at least, and constantly ask ourselves, what can I do to be constructive or to find happiness or to make something of my life? Unless you are willing to put in that effort and be willing to take that risk, you will always be lacking some sense of purpose, and your mind will know it even if you don't consciously realize it, and it will affect you. Make meaning in life. Everyone has skills and everyone has virtue. Human life is inherently virtuous. And regardless of how dark life may seem, you are worth saving and you are worth spending the effort to save. To find what makes you happy in life, or to find what is meaningful to you, to find a way to turn it into a constructive pursuit, pursue it, reap something from it, at the very least your own enjoyment. And when I say constructive pursuits, make something beneficial, make art, make goods, craft, write literature, write music, build houses, fix things, teach people, we know inherently what those constructive pursuits are, and every single one of us has at least one of them in us. I'll be the first to admit life is not always fair, and it can be downright miserable. And as someone who's suffered mental illness myself unashamedly, I know that I've been there. I'm telling you, if you do not give your life meaning, unfortunately nobody else and nothing else will. And if you find yourself being rather nihilistic, unfortunately there is no way out of that darkness than to put in the effort to find purpose. And it's going to be a challenge. The hedonistic idea that if you don't yield success or pleasure in 5 minutes, then it's not worth it, is a complete lie. Some of the most meaningful things in life take years to fully come to fruition. Ask yourself this: if it's possible to make something of your life, and the long-term benefits of making something of your life far outweigh in terms of the positive outcome for you and the happiness that they can bring you, what a simple 5-minute hedonistic pleasure can bring you, why is that not worth it? What is worth it in life if that's not worth it? And if you're struggling, there is help available. If you feel like you're making no progress, make as much progress as you can and do a little bit of that every day, and then after a while, reflect back and examine what you've discovered about yourself. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, if you are concerned about yourself or someone else, please seek help now. Do not ever take what you find in the media or on the internet as advice. And as usual, if you have an opinion about anything, I would love to hear from you. If something that I've discussed on the program today prompts thought for you, or you would like to discuss one of the topics we've discussed today, or a completely different topic with me, or if you'd simply like to make a suggestion about what you'd like to hear me discuss, contact me. I would love to hear from you. And until next time, take care.